and so you will be able then to work on the paper after we have gone through the material. So hopefully it will be easier for you to tackle the question. Any questions so far? I have corrected the papers, but I'll send them after this session, and I'll talk a bit about the papers towards the end of the session. Last 10 minutes or 5 minutes of the session. Okay. Any questions from previous sessions? Has anyone read Huntington and tried to tackle the second question? Okay. Do you see a pattern being drawn from the reading of Huntington? Whether he is Orientalist in chapter 3. Okay, but if he can you show how he is Orientalist? Not just identify that he is Orientalist.
Hello.
Yeah, I've opened the mic. So if you want to talk,
ideas.
Louder, please.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So how he is an Orientalist? For me, like, for as an example, like when he talks about universal civilizations, he's saying that.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. And he's saying that the language, like English language, it's he gives an examples, but in the end he's saying that the English language, it's the global language, and if and he gives an examples how if you want to be civilized, you need to learn the Western language. And I don't know, but he gives an example about Faust. I didn't understand it, something in Swisra, but I didn't understand why he gave this example. But if you can explain it.
Davos. It's the Davos International Economic Forum. Every year they meet.
Yeah.
And we talked the previous article about the مستشرقون الجدد. He mentioned Davos.
Okay.
So Huntington is mentioning that this group of people that meet who have key positions in decision making, economics, and politics, and how they kind of meet together and then go back and disperse to the globe.
Okay, so basically,
and how their influence.
Davos is the small community, like it's small version of the global civilization.
Yeah, well, that's one of the questions. But he's not that how do you straightforward. I mean, he's not always. His line of logic doesn't follow through consistent rationale. What is consistent is something else behind the text.
Yeah, I understand.
Okay. Anyone else wants to questions or observations? Okay. When you try to work on the second question, you need to try to take the points from the two articles. شرقنا في الشرق والاستشراقيون الجدد and Hall's points, which we will continue today. You do not need to use all of them, but kind of they are kind of indicators of what is used in Orientalist packaging of a discourse. Okay, so you need to see then from chapter 3 of Huntington where these apply. Not all of them may apply. But where some of them do, and then you need to show how they take form or they manifest themselves in the chapter, and how in the narrative, in the discourse of Huntington. You do not need to go to outside sources to kind of discover or to show whether Huntington is Orientalist or not. He's categorized as being Orientalist. So, and you will find many articles kind of substantiating this. The purpose of the paper is not to kind of say that whether he is or not. You need to show how he is. It's a more analytical exercise than just kind of categorizing whether he is or not. You need to show how he is and identify where in the text he is kind of being Orientalist. So it's a much more inspective form of analysis. Okay. Fine. We will. Any questions before we begin? Okay. So we will then start with Hall. I'll continue with Hall. You should be able to see the screen. This is. So we reached monopoly of truth. I think we were talking about. We went over what is discourse, ideology, and Oriental representing the other, and how the representing the other takes what are the points of representing the other. Orientalism, okay, and then there's the archive. We have classical knowledge or reference to classical knowledge, biblical sources, mythology, travelers' tales. and then we reach the regime of truth. Okay, so regime of truth means that there's essentially here the implicit just just to make sure you see the text. Okay, all right. Good. Okay. So regime of truth. Why is he puts it in parentheses? Is that the author doesn't believe in the term regime of truth, and therefore he puts it in quotation marks to say that this is alleged or kind of assumed regime of truth, but it's not what Paul is prescribing or condones. So therefore, in your writings, if you're using a term that you're not convinced of, then you can put it within quotation marks just to present it as a quote unquote thing, but it's not something to signify something that you are not completely convinced by. So here, the regime of truth means that the Orientalist or this kind of discourse of representing the other promotes itself as being the source of truth, and that built on a whole structure of knowledge and a heritage of building knowledge and research, and therefore giving it clout or more influence than others, than other truths coming from different scholars or different cultures. So gradually, observation and description vastly improved the accuracy. The medieval habit of thinking in terms of analogies gave way to more sober types of description of fauna and flora, ways of life, customs, physical characteristics, and social organization of native peoples. Here begins the remnants or the start of new fields of study, ethnography and anthropology. But the shift into more descriptive, factual discourse with its claims of truth and scientific objectivity provided no guarantees. And he gives examples. Many myths and legends told of a race of giant people. So even though, in the 1520s, Magellan's crew brought back stories of having encountered in South America such a race of giants, whom they dubbed Patagons, literally big feet. The area of the supposed encounter became known as Patagonia. So therefore, by the first impression, you have names of islands and places given by the first explorers. So these are Western names to East non-Western areas, based on what the first perception of those areas are. And the notion became fixed in popular imagination, even though two Englishmen who visited Patagonia in 1741 described the people as being of average size. So therefore, there's the discrepancy between the narratives. You have in 1520s, Magellan's group say that they've encountered people who are tall and big, and then you have when an Englishman goes to the same area, it's average-sized people. Okay, so therefore, if you have if the if Magellan's group were short, relatively short, and then you had maybe Englishmen who maybe were taller, then you would have different perceptions of sizes depending on analogies, on comparison or analogies with oneself. So the measure of oneself is kind of has a non-objective um, attribute in describing or categorizing others. And there are other stories, and sometimes the narrations or the stories or the descriptions were exaggerated to kind of make them more impressive to those who came back. طيب. So therefore, with regime of truth, there's a sort of reference that who has knowledge of something and who is able to categorize and name others. And it can also mean that it involves institutions of learning, such as in the first article, he names Oxford and other old universities that have kind of invested much research in categorizing or in knowledge about the Orient or the East into different fields: linguistics, biblical studies, scripture, as well as old languages, classical languages, and philosophy. So then we have idealization. Orientalism, Said remarks, is the discipline by which the Orient was and is approached systematically as a topic of learning, discovery, and practice. So here there are three kind of activities going on. Learning about the topic or the East, discovering it, and in a way implementing a practice about how you deal with it and how. So therefore, there's the learning, there's the discovery, and then there's what is actually implemented. It is not just non-active, non-implicated non-implicated activity or kind of endeavor, exercise, Orientalism. In addition, he adds Orientalism designates that collection of dreams, images, and vocabularies available to anyone who has tried to talk about what lies east of the dividing line. So therefore, it also has to do with what toolkit is used to articulate what one experiences or sees or describes the Orient or the East. Between 1590 and 1634, the Flemish engraver Theodore de Bry published in his Historia Americae in 10 illustrated volumes. These were leading examples of how new popular literature about the New World and discoveries there. So it contained elaborate engravings of life and customs in the New World. Here we see the New World revoked. Reworked and represented with European authentic conventions, Western ways of seeing different images of America and superimposed one on the other. For example, he transformed the simple, unpretentious sketches which John White had produced in 1587 of the Algonquin Indians, and he had observed the Virginia facial features were retouched, gestures adjusted, and postures were reworked according to more classical European styles. The effect overall, Hugh Honor observes what to tame to civilize the people White had observed so freshly. So even in the sketches and the drawings that were done, it kind of you have the same features of classical European styles, but say you make you have how to say you have the European features, but with darker skin. And I thought it was something different, but so therefore there is a transformation of and in a way a misrepresentation of the other. I think there's a picture here. Yeah, so the drawings are the drawings from the style of classical European style, superimposed on the sketches to try to kind of make it more aesthetically acceptable. A major object of this process of idealization was nature itself. The fertility and the tropics was astonishing even to Mediterranean eyes. Few had ever seen landscapes like those in the Caribbean and Central America. So, however, the line between description and idealization is almost impossible to draw. In describing Cuba, for example, Columbus refers to trees of 1,000 kinds. So tall they seem to touch the sky. And sierras and high mountains, most beautiful and thousands shapes. Nightingales and other birds, marvelous pine groves, fertile plains, etc. So therefore, the way that the language used to kind of describe what they have no reference to visually or kind of aesthetically before in Europe kind of takes on an exaggerated expression, like trees touching the skies and mountains of 1,000 shapes. In a way, it kind of illustrates a problem is of describing something you have no reference to before. So therefore, the only way to describe something new is based on what one already knows, which is could be regarded as a handicap in describing something new, rather than understanding the new based on its objective attributes. You kind of repackage the new in old or available kit or toolkit of expression in the description, which kind of doesn't do justice then to the subject studied per se. So the key themes in the passage, so there's a passage here which is kind of a good example. The inhabitants live in the golden world of which all writers speak so much, wherein men lived simply and innocently without enforcement of laws, without quarreling, judges, and libels, content only to satisfy nature. They are naked, so here talking about the women, and that one might think he beheld those splendid in the fountains of celebrated in the ancients. So talking about ancient Greek or ancient mythology. So the key themes here is there's the golden world, earthly paradise, simple, innocent. Golden world and earthly paradise means that it's something to go. There are riches to be had. So you're going to the other places to get to benefit from what is from the resources and the riches of that place. Also, to be because it's earthly paradise, it's away from the problems of Europe or where they come from, or the Mediterranean. It is seemingly void of inherent problems. So, but implicitly meaning that the problems are basically coming from Europe. You compare the other places by European problems, so that if you don't see the European problems in the other places are paradise. Now, this doesn't mean that the other places don't have their own problems as well, but it's just it's not seen compared to what one is accustomed to. Now, the second point of being simple and innocent is also a kind of a measure that, okay, people are simple and life is innocent and untarnished by, say, venture capitalism or greed, or kind of what some of the thinkers and philosophers say, the realists or the conservative approach, or that what drives human beings is basic greed and instincts. So here you have instincts, yes, but they're not driven by greed. So therefore, there's a sort of innocence. But then it also, by describing the other as simple and innocent, you open the door. Okay, if somebody is simple and innocent, then there is room for being cunning and conniving and manipulative and kind of tarnishing, exploiting the innocent to your own advantage. So therefore, inducing what is not, or introducing what is not innocent and not simple, more sophisticated, into the realm and the societies and the peoples of the other people. The lack of development of developed social organization and civil society. So if one doesn't see a developed social structure as compared to Europe, it is regarded as being underdeveloped. Whereas if you analyze more closely how maybe the First Nations in the North America, and even in the Central Americas, how the social structure is built, and how the consensus is important, and collective arriving at collective decision making is also important, and the role of the chief, and there's a stratification, a social stratification of power. It's it's not a simple structure. It's quite sophisticated, but the purpose of that is more harmonious than, say, conflictive and individualist. And civil society. So therefore, if it is perceived that the other has a lack of social organization and underdeveloped civil society, it means that it's open for new interpretations and more imposition of the social organization and society. So that's, for example, by introducing venture capitalism, self-interest, individualism, and the other ideas. People living in pure nature, state of nature. So, this kind of has a bit to do with the innocent life, is that it is so untouched by, say, medieval politics, medieval influences, or industrial revolution, and all the revolutions that went on in Europe, and therefore it kind of reminds them of how life was before medieval or modern history, meaning that in contrast, there is a lot that can be shaped in this new, in this untouched nature. by the hand of whom? By the hand of those who are exploring and coming into control of these areas. Then there's the sexual fantasy. Well, this has to do with the innocence and what they wear, what they do not wear, and how they kind of perceive that. And so it kind of excites the imagination of those who are there, going, and how they perceive the whole structure, and how they perceive the male-female relations, and who is dominant, who is subordinate. Bearing in mind that most of the travelers spent a lot of time. It took months to cross the oceans, and therefore that had an impact on fantasizing and romanticizing other people in various ways. Okay, misrecognizing difference. So how is difference interpreted and perceived? Said says that the essence of Orientalism is the ineradicable distinction between Western superiority and Orientalist inferiority. So there's always this dominant subordinate who is more advanced and who is primitive. How was this strong marketing difference constructed? Europeans were immediately struck by what they interpreted as the absence of government and civil society. So if they didn't see that there was a government and the central building in the societies they came to, they assumed that there was lawlessness and there was no physical structure of society, and physical simple symbols of structures of society, such as a court or a police station or a palace or something, or the like. So Europeans were immediately struck by what they interpreted as the absence of government, civil society, and the basis of civilization among peoples, often the New World. In fact, these peoples did have several very different, highly elaborate social structures, but it would take a lot of examining for those discoverers to engage in and understand the intricacies of these cultures. So the New World, the Europeans discovered, was already home to millions of people who had lived there for centuries, whose ancestors had migrated to America from Asia across the neck of the land which once connected the two continents. We're talking about the connection between Alaska and Asia. Alaska, North America with Asia. So there's this kind of connection over when the two continents were closer, or when the ocean at that during the winters was frozen, so it could be people could move from one continent to the other over the ice. In this, it is estimated that 60 million people were living in the Western Hemisphere when the Spanish discovered it. So you have 16 million nations, people of First Nations living in the North America, or in the in the Western Hemisphere. The highest concentration was in Mexico. You had the Inca and Aztec civilizations there, while only 1 million lived in North America, and they were different. They had very different standards of styles of life. The Pueblo of Central America were village people. Others were hunter-gatherers, and on the plains and in the forests. The Arawaks of the Caribbean islands had a relatively simple type of society. So you have a diverse combination of social structures and lifestyles, varying from those who were fixed in villages and those who were hunter-gatherers moving across the plains. The high civilization of the Maya with its dazzling white cities was based on the developed agriculture. So you had the Maya, the Aztec civilization, Inca in Peru, which had different culture and very sophisticated forms of social structure. Here we're talking about now the societies that the discoverers found were the functioning societies. It wasn't like they were random. Yeah, and what they were not was European. So because they were not European, they were compared or contrasted to the toolkit for describing them was how they were not European. So they were described by how they were not European rather than what they were. Okay. Which is a particular mindset of how you kind of describe something new or something that is unfamiliar or something that you have no reference to. Incidentally, when one of the challenges of describing the situation here in Palestine, what is happening is that it becomes very difficult to explain the details of the strife here to people who have no reference to what type of life one is going through. So the only way for people from the outside to begin to understand the multi-layered dimensions and the intensity of and intrusiveness of life here under settler colonialism is that they come here and experience for themselves, and therefore have this build this sort of reference from which they can then build on articulation or knowledge or description or an analysis of what's going on here. So one of the challenges you find when you go abroad is that you can describe what is happening, but if what you're describing is not has no reference in the other person from another context, you need to bridge the description by interfacing with analogies or examples that they would understand within their own context. So you need to kind of transform this experience into how it would look like in their own culture or political setting, which takes a lot of effort. Yeah. So don't assume you cannot make assumptions that people will understand. So you have to be, which is why if you have something which is unfamiliar to others, or you need to be very specific and very precise in use of terminology. Incidentally, one of the comments about the papers is that some of you, not all, but some use kind of colorful language, which has more to do with poetry than say academic terms. And why the problem with that is that it's okay if you're in a dominant narrative society or context, but if you're trying to put forth something that needs more precision, you need to be more precise in the use of terminology and what you mean. Well, one of the examples from the papers is that it is some expressions are that it is obvious, it is clear, or in papers which have analytical content, nothing is obvious unless you've shown that it is obvious. Nothing is clear, is absolutely clear unless you've shown that something is clear, and nothing is absolute in social sciences. So everything you can be close to, or maybe show that it is it veers more onto something, but you cannot say in absolute terms that that is something is absolutely true or absolutely um, absolutely clear. Okay, in social sciences, it's very difficult to achieve this, and to use terms like this is not kind of precise. Okay, back to the text here. So there's about Columbus, and the behavior of Europeans was governed by the complex understandings and norms which regulated their own systems of monetary exchange, trade, and commerce. So how the Europeans exchanged with or did trade with the First Nations was based on their reference of how they do trade in Europe. Which means that if you could fool someone who was less, how to say, less knowledgeable of the practices of trade in Europe, then that was okay. Okay, so there is no moral, there is very little of moral standard in upholding relations or how you do things with non-Europeans as non-Europeans as also being human beings. But then that was part of the whole mindset of expansion and control and exploitation and to control nature, and therefore the one who gets more riches out of nature or finds more treasures in the new lands becomes more powerful kingdoms and can bring more gold, silver, and resources to the to the home to the mother countries or to the kings or queens or monarchs of the European countries, states. Therefore, the Europeans felt free to organize the continuous supply of such gifts for their own benefit. With the exchanges, the bartering, what the Europeans found difficult to comprehend was that the exchange of gifts was part of a highly complex but different set of social practices. For example, the Europeans who came with the intent of doing trade or with a more trade-oriented mindset, you could say abused the gift, the exchange of gift practice and norms in the social settings they found themselves into. For example, here, when in our culture you give a gift to someone, it means that you have to return a gift at a later occasion, for example, or something comparable. It is no gift is just taken without some sort of rebalancing of the gift exchange. In some cultures, the exchange of gift, the gift that is given to you is kept and then is given again to another person, so that the gift keeps on going as a symbolic gesture of exchange rather than actually making use of the gift itself. And in some ways, at some points, the whole idea of the gift exchange is much more complex than just the item. It is the rituals that go behind that are entailed in it. So then if we have 4.7, the seventh point, rituals of degradation. And here we come to cannibal feast, or kind of eating the flesh of other people, and how this is kind of exaggerated or misrepresented. For example, you've heard of scalping. I'm opening the mic. Have you heard of this term? Does anybody know what it means? I'm opening the mic for everyone. Unmute all. Anybody? Okay. Anyone? Okay, this is if you watch old Western movies with the cowboys and their encounters with the Native Americans. So therefore, one of the scenes is that, or one of the kind of ideas promoted is that during the raids. During the raids, you would have the Indians come to cut the skin off the head of the settlers, the white people. Okay, and therefore it was attributed that the violence of the First Nations was so brutal that it justified the use of brutal measures to kind of to protect the settlers from the First Nations or in the Americas. Now it turns out that those who began the scalping ritual were not the Native Americans or First Nations; it was the Spanish. And therefore, the ritual, why? Because there used to be, by the number of scalps that could be raised, you would get money on how many First Nation people you were able to kill, and then how much land you were able to control. So therefore, this kind of attribute of brutal kind of cutting off the skin from the head with the hair to mark, instead of bringing bodies, counting bodies, you count the scalps. So therefore, this kind of Spanish form of control of property and elimination of the other kind of became practiced in some of the First Nations when dealing with settlers who came in North America. So therefore, this is kind of an example of how some practices coming from Europe were actually reattributed to the First Nations and to kind of emphasize the brutality, the primitiveness and brutality of the nations that they came to conquer. Okay, so rituals and degradation. So some of the rituals, like described here, represent the actual practices of the Europeans and the First Nations experience of European practices, which then kind of became, in some situations, practiced by the First Nations. Okay, so then we go to another. Okay, there's a question of cannibalism and represents a puzzle which has never been resolved. Human sacrifices, which may have included cannibalism, was associated with some religious rituals. Particularly when you talk about the Aztec and the Inca. There are many. There may have been ritual sacrifices involving some cannibalism of captured enemies, but careful reviews of the relevant literature now suggest that the hard evidence is much sketchier and more ambiguous than has been assumed. So here there's a form of if there was some form of human sacrifice and kind of eating of some organs, such as the heart or the liver, for some kind of spiritual purposes, rituals, then it was exaggerated, and therefore you have the whole internet becoming cannibals or attributed as such. But this also works into this discourse of the Orientalists that okay, if those people are like that, then it's justifiable to use barbarism or violence or other means to kind of contain them, like as if you're containing or trying to control nature itself. So therefore, you have summaries of stereotypes, dualism, and splitting. There is the Hugh Honor, who studied European images of America from the period of discovery onwards, has remarked that Europeans increasingly tended to see in America an idealized and distorted image of their own countries. So it's interesting. Europeans increasingly tended to see in America an idealized or distorted image of their own country. So their reference is either distorted or idealized of their own reference of Europe. So in essence, their reference of what they're describing is from Europe, whether in the idealized sense or in the distorted, disruptive sense, onto which they could project their own aspirations and fears. So therefore, the canvas or the landscape of their emotions was and their practices and instincts was kind of painted by their reference to Europe, whether in the good sense or in the negative sense. And therefore their self-confidence and guilt and despair. So all these, we have identified some of these discursive strategies which of this kind of Orientalist form is the idealization, the projection of fantasies and desire and degradation, the failure to recognize and respect difference. Okay. The tendency to impose European categories and norms, see difference through the modes of perception and representations of the West. So some of these are useful in your analysis of Huntington. When is he idealizing? What is he idealizing? Is there a projection of some sort of desires and degradation? If fantasies, I don't know about fantasies, but at least degradation, failure to recognize and respect the difference. Where do you see this in this chapter? The tendency to impose European categories and norms. Well, there are several examples of this in this chapter. Be it with regard to modernization, what is the modern state? How do you become modernized? And therefore, what are the stepping stones and stages to reach modernization? He has a specific view about how one does that. You see the difference through the mode of perception and representation of the West. So therefore, how the other civilizations are viewed is more an indication of what the West is seeing rather than what the other civilizations are. Then there's also stereotyping. in بالعربي is that you assume that if one section of the people does something, you assume that the whole people are the same. So the define they define it as being the essence. Okay, here's an example. As always, the stereotype operates principally through a judicious combination of adjectives. So therefore, see what terms are used to kind of describe the other, also with reference to Huntington. There's somebody who's moving and making noise on the microphone. If you can mute that. Which established certain characteristics as if they were eternal verities, truths. So therefore, the stereotype becomes a truth or a combination of truths, immune from the irrelevancies of the historical comment. Ferocious, warlike, hostile, truculent, and vindictive. So what adjectives are used or terms are used are also indications of stereotypes. And you can identify in the text in Huntington some stereotypical expressions, which also indicate that he's kind of using this kind of this discursive package or toolkit. These are present and innate characteristics irrespective of circumstances. Consequently, in the Caribbeans were locked as cannibals into a realm of beingness that lies beyond question. This stereotypical dualism has proved stubbornly immune to all kinds of contradictory evidence. So the point here is that once a stereotype has kind of become entrenched in a discourse, it is very difficult to undo it. Okay. For example, when I showed you the picture of the people praying on the roof, one of the imposed one of the stereotypes is stereotypical attributes is that people are in this region are very unorganized, even when it comes to prayer, which is supposed to be the most serious and most spiritual aspect of one's life here. So therefore, if you're unorganized in this, how can you be organized in any form of state structure and political structure, social organization, and any other form of organization? Which means then that, okay, if this is the norm in this region, therefore you will always need somebody from the outside to kind of sort things out. Like Terry Rod Larson, his comment about the ethnic division, that this region has many, is multi-ethnic, and therefore there are different aspirations of the multi-ethnic groups here, and therefore you will always be fighting, and you will always be fighting because you're incapable of arriving to consensus, which requires rational abilities, and therefore you will always need somebody from the outside with more sophistication and more stable attributes to always be interfering here. And therefore, the problem of this region is not, say, colonization and the formation of, say, states with colonial, fulfilling colonial or neo-colonial aspirations, such as the Zionist state, but rather that you are incapable of living in the modernized, civilized world. Okay, so these are sort of stereotypes, the stereotypical dualism. So there are two. The stereotypical dualism has two opposing elements. These are two key features of the discourse of the other. So you need to try to see where in Huntington this is being applied. First, several characteristics are collapsed into one simplified figure, which stands for or represents the essence of the people. That is stereotyping. The second stereotype is split into two halves. Is good and bad sides that is splitting the dualism. Splitting the dualism. There's a stereotyping, categorizing the other as being, for example, warlike, hostile, vindictive, etc., ferocious. And then there is the good and the bad sides. This kind of negative imaging, the binary, what is called as the binary depiction of the us and the other. That the us is totally good, then the other is everything bad in the us, attributed onto the other. Okay. Perhaps any questions, and then we'll need a 5-minute break before we go into Huntington with fresh minds. Any questions so far? I've opened the mic, so if you want to ask something, or if you have any thoughts that come to mind when you from what we have covered. Okay, let me give you an example about maybe how attributes here can be interpreted in different ways. For example, if when tourists come and they want to buy something, and they pass a souvenir shop or any type of shop, and they say that they are told from when they come at the airport, if they're coming from the Israeli terminals, that when you go to the Arab places, you should always bargain. And try not to. And usually, when the groups come, they come there to say the Palestinian areas, Jericho, Bethlehem, at the end of their trip, not in the beginning, so that there is not much currency left to, unless they come specifically to the Palestinian areas. But the idea is that, okay, you have markets in Europe, for example, in the West, where people kind of, this is the auctioning, where somebody pays, where something is sold based on who is paying the highest. Okay. Now, and the starting bid starts from a particular price, and then it goes upward, or if nobody wants to buy, then it goes down. But say it is normal practice in the once a week in some places, during one day in a week, in some places in whether Britain or Holland or elsewhere, you would have this kind of village market in the center of the city, where you have produce coming from the villages or selling their produce, and there's a fixed price, or you can bargain. So therefore, المفاصلة غاد is normal practice, okay? But how it is interpreted in the context of East-West and in an Orientalist discourse is that it has different implications. So therefore, if the price of the tourist asks that what is the price of, say, this sort of souvenir, and the shopkeeper says, okay, it's for example, say $100. And then the tourist says, oh, but this is too much, and starts walking away. And then the shopkeeper says, oh, come back. I will give you a special price. And then it goes down to $70. And then the tourist thinks again and says, no, this is still too much. I will go. And then he says, okay, I need to go. Tries to bring him, and then eventually sells the item for, say, $40 or $30. So this is not a form of bargaining as much as it is a form of trying to win a customer. But how is it interpreted from the tourist's perspective as opposed to the one who is trying to sell? Can you give me some feedback? And how can this be perceived as being Orientalist? Or how can it be shifted to be a form of fitting into stereotyping an Orientalist? I'm unmuting, so if you want to talk. Or you can text in the chatting section. Have you understood the question? Well, okay, perhaps unorganized prices, but what else? In this scene, okay, what are the typical happenings or attributes? So, yeah, okay, there's not trust. Who wrote this? Yeah, there's the mistrust. Why? Because the price, the price changes several times. So one stereotype is nothing for sale is the real price. Another thing is that you cannot trust these people. Why? Because they always lie about things, including prices. So therefore, you have this aspect that you cannot trust them. They're always greedy, and therefore they're always lying. They never tell the truth. And if they express emotion, it is primitive and raw, not refined or sophisticated. So these are stereotyping ways. Just by the simple exchange of selling somebody from an Oriental or kind of lived in this Orientalist discursive formation of how they kind of read what is happening here. Yeah, anybody want to add?
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah. So since I work in tourism, so I see a lot of things like that. So once, even if you want to offer them a service and you give them a price, they would be like, I don't earn that much. You know, it's like they look down and underestimate the other sometimes.
Yeah, well, there are two aspects. Well, yeah, okay, there are two. Now, those who might come from say well-to-do countries, yeah, they probably they come with they come with surplus money that they can spend. Okay, but some of those who come from outside, say if you're coming from Eastern Europe or former Eastern European republics, or maybe from Southern Europe or other places, their income is not as high as the living standards here. So we're living if you talk about within the Israeli economy, the standard the cost of living there is is comparable to a cost of living of a state in Europe, even sometimes more. Yeah. And the cost of living in the West Bank is much higher, say, than the cost of living of in Jordan. For example, an employee in Jordan would get maybe 300, 500 dinars. This doesn't. You cannot live on 500 dinars a month if you're in the West Bank. They're under current conditions. So some of them genuinely save, put a lot of savings over many years to be able to make this one trip here. So for them, everything counts. But then you have those others who come from more affluent, who you know are from more affluent societies and states that can afford to spend, but they would rather do it in the Israeli places, which aesthetically and are designed to kind of be similar to their reference to malls and shops and places from where they come from, and therefore they feel more, perhaps psychologically more comfortable in dealing or spending there. There are other factors, is that the tour guide gets a percentage of what group buys from the. So there's kind of a lot of deals that go on. But also the political aspect is that most of the tourists that come into the Palestinian areas, if they are passing through Israeli guides and tourist agencies, they visit these areas at the end of the trip, not at the beginning or when they would have money. Yeah. Any other ideas or thoughts? There are new messages. Let's check the new messages. What about the good itself? It could be seen as worthless because it is made here and has no good quality. Well, sometimes, but I mean, if you look at some of the pottery ceramics of Hebron, or maybe the ceramics in the old city, and glass and olive carvings, they can be of very high quality. So some of them, yes, are worth their price. Now, but the problem is that if you try to, if there's this if some shopkeepers sell items that are made in China and say that well it's made here, that's where you lose credibility, and it affects the reputation. Then this tourist goes back and says, look, they're selling things that they claim to be from their own heritage, but it's made in China, for example. So then there is no justification for kind of having a particular price setting. Any other thoughts or ideas or reactions? So therefore, the point here is that do not assume that the other person is reading you or is understanding what you're doing or what one is saying the way you are understanding, or particularly if there's a difference in culture. So you need to make sure that you touch base with a common reference, and therefore build on that to kind of engage in a meaningful discussion, which does not end up you talking symbols or words which mean different things to them or have different interpretations or connotations or contexts. So you talk about maybe a struggle for liberation, they would see it as something, well, why violent? Why be violent? When there's no violence, when you come to visit this place and you go in the Israeli society, you do not see, there's no violence. Only when here you see threats of violence or something. So there's kind of the point here is that, like in the papers you write, which are supposed to be analytical and academic, you need to be precise, and you do not assume that the other person understands what you're saying. I'm not talking about the words. I'm talking about what the words mean and what they imply. You need to be much sharper, even more sharper than the common than somebody from another context or similar context, who are cross conversing with each other, than when you're doing a cross-cultural, cross-political reality engagement. Okay, this is something which is important. Okay, perhaps take a 5 minutes break, and then at 36 or 37 we come back and start with Huntington. Unless you want to continue. I suggest a 5 minute break. Continue or break. Okay, break for 5 minutes. And perhaps what is proposing as the reason for reorganizing the world or remaking the world order is that there is a clash of civilization on the horizon. And he's talking about he published this book in 1996. The article came in the early 90s, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and this kind of American to prevent the clash of civilization, or to kind of to hinder push back a clash of civilizations that could emerge. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, therefore, Huntington begins that there's a new culture emerging. It's a universal civilization. The components of this universal civilization is that there's humanity is coming together under common values and common beliefs, common orientations, same practices, institutions, and people. More specifically, the idea may mean some things which are more profound but irrelevant, some which are relevant but not profound, and some which are relevant and superficial. So he proposes this universal civilization, then gives some how it is universal civilization, what are its components, and then he kind of introduces possibilities of analysis of the terms, in which some are the idea may mean some things which are very deep, but not important. Some which are important but not deep, and some which are not neither important nor deep, or are very superficial. So therefore, what do you sense from what do you sense when you read this from the first? What are your first thoughts when you read this? I've unmuted you also. You can speak if you want. So? Any reactions? Are you with me, or are you thinking? He tried to how does he try to shape our reaction to the new idea from the beginning, from the first paragraph? Okay, one thing. If we go to the previous, what is meant by the term?
Does he, Doctor? Yeah. Can I, sir? Does he try? Is he trying to put measures or criteria to be accepted as a civilization or a culture? And does he trying to reshape or like make distinctive responses to some of these values, beliefs, and so on?
Yes, but how is he doing this? He gives when he tries to give the meaning of the universal civilization, he puts in several terms, like values, beliefs, orientations, practices, institutions, and people. Okay, so he has several themes which he must he says these are important in understanding what the universal civilization is. Now, when he goes to this sentence, you get the impression that he's open-minded and open to all possibilities or variations of possibilities of combinations of these. So you come out from the first paragraph saying that okay, universal civilization has several components, and he's open to kind of juggling which are most important, which are less, and what not. So he leaves that to what is to come, but he gives you the impression that he is open to various possibilities. Okay, so as an introduction,
Do they mean the responses?
Which
the last thing you said about various availabilities.
Yeah. Okay. What do you feel when you or what do you sense when he provides this various possibilities? He acknowledges that some are profound, deep, but could be not important to this universal civilization. Some are important but not deep. Okay, and some are neither deep nor important. So therefore, some of these are not important nor deep. Okay, but he doesn't say which. So this is a way of introducing you to get the reader to come to engage with him. So there are also you need to also understand the tactic, the methods used to kind of bring the reader in. So sometimes when you're reading, you may feel uncomfortable with what you're reading. You sense that something is not right, but you don't know where something is not right is. So you need to kind of be aware of what are the techniques used to kind of bring in a reader into and engage with the proposition, particularly of a class of civilizations. Okay, what is important and relevant for him is what means by Western civilization and what terms implies. This is yes, in the end, but he's not openly expressing this. He kind of moves from one side to the other and tries to make you see that he's looking at things from different angles. And therefore, when you see him looking at things from different angles, that's when he kind of then introduces his direction. So you need to be, and when you're reading Huntington, you need to be aware when he's trying to appeal to you, to attract you to what he's thinking or what he's proposing, and where he kind of, once he has brought you into his into his comfort zone, out of your comfort zone, that is when he kind of puts in a statement which makes a shift. So there's pulling in and then making shift, pulling in, making shift, pulling in, making shift, and this is how he gets you involved in questioning what essentially you consider as being valid and not valid. Okay, we'll continue. His first proposition is that for human beings, virtually all societies share certain basic values. And such as murder is evil, and certain basic institutions such as some form of the family. Okay, so one universal aspect is that all societies have some sort of basic values, such as murder is evil. Okay, if you have murder is evil, does it mean that all societies do not commit murder? In them, in the criminal sense, inside or mass murder across continental when you have international relations. Okay, such as bombarding civilian areas and whatnot. This is also part of war crimes, and therefore, yes. So if all societies have this basic value, when is this who has the power to uphold this value, and who has the power to circumvent this value and get away with committing murder, and yes, promoting certain or claiming to represent certain basic values. Okay, and then certain basic institutions. Okay, basic such as the family. Yes, family is important, but then in some societies you have the breakdown of in some European societies, if not Western societies, marriage is not considered socially as a valid institution, a basic institution of a social institution. Why? Because it is too laborious. You get married, you have then commitments, and you're confined to one another, and then you have children, which brings on responsibilities and social and economic responsibilities. So only a few. It has become a selected few that kind of follow this, still practice this institution, and with cross-gender and transgender aspects, it becomes more difficult to kind of say what a family is as a basic institution. And here you would have profound differences between certain cultures and other cultures about what constitutes a family. Okay, so in this sense, he is kind of trying to pull or to pass that certain things can be basic values, when essentially the practice of these basic values is very political. And what constitutes the institution of family, and who defines what is a family, and how a family is, what the role of family in society is, very political as well. So most people in most societies have a similar moral sense, or a thin minimal morality of basic concepts, of which what is right and wrong. Okay, essentially, but not necessarily. So therefore, he's trying to say that most societies, if there's something similar like moral sense, or a minimal morality of basic concepts, okay, you would need to question then what is the motive behind this moral sense? Is it social stability, maintaining some sort of order, or if you have moral sense, then you do not need police, or you would need less policing than other places. So why, for example, in the United States, the policing is very kind of brutal compared to method policing, say, in other societies in Europe. Okay, if there's a basic moral sense, or that there's a basic moral, and who is promoting this moral sense? Is it from the central government that which is practicing moral sense, or is it just left to the most powerful in society? And then power defines what is moral. If this is what is meant by universal civilization, it is both profound and profoundly important. So therefore, the moral sense and the concept of what is right or wrong, these for him are fundamental values and constants in human behavior, which illuminate and explain history. Okay, so history, you study history and determine what is moral and what is right and wrong in history. Okay, which consists of changes in human behavior. Okay, so then history is a moral exercise about who stuck to their thin moral sense, and who got a way of doing non-moral acts, and who promoted wrong as right and promoted right as wrong. Now, this is a very simplistic way of going over history. History is much more sophisticated if you want to analyze, say, dynamics of decision making, dynamics of what went into a sequence of events, how a certain sequence of events and dynamics all may particular outcome. Who's right and the bad guy, which is good. But this kind of binary aspect of who is right and wrong and who is moral and who is immoral is also the binary of the discourse in Orientalism, is that there's the good and the bad, the right and the wrong. And in history is studied as who is good and bad and who is right and wrong, which is not, which is kind of very selective. In addition to a universalized universal civilization common to all humanity exists what term we do what term do we then use to identify the major cultural groupings of humanity and human race? Humanity is divided into subgroups, tribes, nations. Here it's interesting. Humanity is divided into subgroups, tribes, nations, and broader cultural entities normally called civilization. In terms of civilization, it is elevated and restricted to what is common to humanity as a whole. Either one has to invent a new term to refer to the largest cultural grouping of people short of humanity as a whole, or one has to assume that these large but not humanity-wide groupings evaporate. What is he trying to say? That you need another term than humanity to kind of express what the new civilization is emerging, and therefore he's talking with these universal civilization rather than human. So, what is the difference between humanity and civilization? Is that humanity, you can have humanity of different backward civilizations or non-civilizations and civilizations, advanced civilizations. But therefore, when he repackages the term as the universal civilization, he attributes that its civilization has a particular standard to keep up, to maintain. We now so, and then he has a quote from Václav Havel. We now live in a single global civilization, and that is no more than a thin veneer that covers or conceals the immense variety of cultures, of peoples, religions, worlds, of historical traditions and historically formed attitudes, all of which, in a sense, lie beneath it. So therefore, all the diversity is underneath the global civilization. And this means that all what is underneath the global civilization is secondary to the value of the global civilization. Okay, you can say we have people living in one globe, it's one thing, but to say to substitute the people with the term civilization as a globe, therefore it means that there is one civilization on planet Earth. Which has diversities, but what is controlling all the diversities is this kind of global unified civilization. And coming back to the title, is relevant than remaking the world order. So with that in mind, you begin to see what he's talking about. He's using a quote from a leader of an East European country, global civilization, to kind of say that it's not me who's saying that we're living in a global civilization. You have other people who have emerged from the Cold War saying that we are now in a global civilization, which is very diverse. But you need somebody to organize and control this global civilization, which is what he's trying to bring to push through. Only Semitic confusion, however, is gained by restricting civilization to the global level and disengaging
designating as cultures or sub-civilizations those largest cultural entities which have historically always been called civilizations. So here, civilizations means those that have historically been called civilizations from before. We are over time. Do you have can we go on until 30? Half past the 30, or shall we stop here and continue next time? And I'll talk about the papers. How much? Okay, we. Yes, what he means by Western civilization, this comes later in this chapter. Okay, we'll go on to the universal civilizations, just this paragraph, and then the third we start on Tuesday. Second term of universal civilization could be used to refer to what civilized societies have in common, such as cities and literacy, which distinguish them from primitive societies and barbarians. So therefore, civilized societies have cities, and they have language and written language and documentation. So therefore, if you are from the civilization that is orally based, not written based, therefore you do not have literacy according to Hunting. If you no longer have cities or relics of cities from the past, or your cities are all new, then you are not part of a civilization. You're part of a consumer segment of humanity, which then distinguishes from primitive societies and barbarians. So therefore, the cities and literacy distinguish them from the negative aspects, the primitive and the barbarians. He's not saying places with no cities. He says societies that are living with which have no cities, maybe live in tents or live in huts or something. And if you're not literate, then you are a barbarian. So therefore, how he kind of the contrast of terms are not how to say consistent or relating to one another. Cities and societies, literacy, barbarians. Okay, this of course, the 18th century singular meaning of the term, and in the sense a universal civilization is emerging, much to the horror of various anthropologists and others who view with dismay the disappearance of primitive peoples. So again, he goes back to the 18th century, which is the period in which modern European states became modern, or transformed from middle age, and also the settler colonial enterprises in the United States, in the Americas, Australia, and elsewhere. So therefore, the 18th century is very significant for Huntington, and therefore it is the reference to the sense of universal civilization emerging. 18th century happenings is the key to universal civilization emergence, and here he's being sarcastic, saying that the anthropologists and kind of dread or view in dismay the kind of the disappearance of primitive peoples. And he would say primitive peoples, but the anthropologists would say very sophisticated societies, but with different structures, like what Hall was talking about. And so therefore there is this kind of imposition or primitive peoples, of anybody who's not 18th century Western trajectory or path or phase referenced is primitive. So civilization in this sense has been gradually expanding throughout human history. And the spread of civilization in the singular has been quite compatible with the existence of many civilizations in the plural. So he says that, notice how he kind of slips from one proposition to the other. His emphasis on what is civilized is 18th century, primarily Western experience, Western being Europe and Americas and Australia and the settler colonial areas. Yet here he kind of says, and the spread of civilization in the singular is quite compatible with the existence of many civilizations in the plural. So therefore, while his main reference is 18th century of what is civilization, he then ends the paragraph in saying that, yes, but civilization can be compatible with the plural. Okay, so there are other references to civilizations other than the 18th century one. So in a way, he's somewhat contradicting himself. He's promoting this, but ends the paragraph with this so as to kind of neutralize what he's promoting here as a literary tactic. So therefore, you read this, you say, "Oh, this is kind of very Eurocentric or Western-centric." But then he says, "Okay," but he gives ample space for civilization to emerge throughout history. So if you're from the non-Western reader, you would think that since he's including human history, you can argue that you have at some point represented part of human history. Even though his reference is 18th century, his pivotal reference is that. Okay, we will stop here with Huntington. If you read the rest, try to kind of decipher more of this. Here we have Davos the forum in Switzerland, and also pay attention to the tables. He has two tables about language, which languages are increasing and which languages are decreasing from 58 to 92. They're old, but it's indicative about how he uses the argument and the number of people speaking the languages and the increase in population and the increase in the which religions are becoming more prominent, which has increased and which has decreased, and whether there's a discrepancy in how he promotes particular his idea. So we will start next time from the third component of the universal civilization, and now I'll talk about the papers a bit. There are the papers they range from excellent to it could be better. Things you must be aware of and you should practice is that you need to stick to the question assignment. The first paper is not a research paper and open research paper where you talk about nationalism. It is not giving a historical kind of overview of what nationalism is about. No, there's a particular question. This is a targeted question assignment. and therefore you have to stick to the question and tackle the question. You cannot create your own version of the assignment title. Okay. If you do so, it should be close to what the gist of the question is asking, not changing the path of the whole research, so it suits what you know already or what you can handle. You have to engage with the question. This will be if you go abroad and you're given a particular question to work on as an assignment. You cannot reinterpret you redesign the question so that it suits what you want to do. There's a particular, when you will be doing your thesis or maybe assignments which talk about do a research on something, that's when you have more space to kind of explore. But here I've given you specific readings which you have to engage with. You can go to other readings if you've engaged with the readings, but not to replace or substitute going in depth in the readings. And it is not good enough to just use one quote from one reading and the other from the other, and then kind of make a basic superficial web of connections and then present that as a paper. This is not what the assignment was about. Okay, so those who did not answer the question, it affected their grade. That's one. The other thing is that I sense that part of in some papers, it is something from another paper which is brought into this paper to fill space. And therefore, if this is the case, you cannot use papers from other class assignments to kind of put them into this class assignment and assume that it will pass. No, again, the question does not give room for using other papers in this paper unless it's something very specific which can enhance your argument. But you do not use sections from other papers to kind of substitute this assignment, particularly when there's a specific question you have to address. Okay. The third important point is that, it is absolutely unacceptable to write a paper without citation. You cannot write 10 pages on an MA in an MA class without having citations, especially if this is a home assignment. If you're writing an exam question, a response to an exam question in class, therefore, and it's a closed book, then okay, fine. You do reference, you don't have to do citation, but at least you do. If you're using ideas, you in the text, in the answer, you make reference to whose ideas these are in discussions. But it's absolutely unacceptable to present an MA paper in an MA class which has no reference at all, no citation at all. Why? Not just because of the aesthetic, not because it looks wrong. Because you're supposed to be able to contribute in your assignments to the body of knowledge, of existing knowledge, and give your analytical voice. If you have no references, it means that you are kind of casually using some events without substantiating the validity of your analysis. And it could lead to errors in terms of historical errors and in factual errors. So therefore, which are unacceptable, and increase the potential for misreading and making false or making arriving at false conclusion, inaccurate conclusion, not false, inaccurate conclusions. Okay, so anybody who has submitted a paper without citation has failed automatically. Okay. And then I explained the points about the use of terms such as it's absolutely clear, or it's no doubt, and you cannot use such terms in academic papers unless you've shown that there is no doubt or it's absolutely clear. Okay, this is good for kind of compositions, kind of non rigorous academic work. But when you talk about academic work, you have to be precise about what terms you use, because it kind of it pulls down the seriousness of the work you're doing. If you just add these terms as an add-on semantics. Also, try not to use expressions such as etc. Because if you're very precise in what in your thought and what you're using as components to build your argument or analysis, etc., opens it to everything. So therefore, if you've gone on a very deliberate and specific train of thought, and then you open it to etc. or things like that, or the similar, you open you open up for rebuttal and criticism. The other thing you need to be aware of when you're writing is that you need to try to make it tight. The analysis and the argument tight, so that there are no loops, no gaps, because the gaps and the loops are the places where you will be challenged. And therefore, even if you have a good idea, but it's not substantiated or not presented in an analytical way, it will be debunked. It will be kind of torn to shreds. Okay? So the effort you put in writing and analyzing and being precise and being sequential, even presenting the historical events is very important in preventing or cutting off criticism of your work. You can you move it then onto the level of engaging in discussion about the ideas, rather than kind of being devastated by a technical inconsistency or a technical term or a technical aspect of the paper, which then kind of would pull down the whole paper. Okay, so be careful. Most of you are likely to go to study abroad. There is no Yam Marhamin that you can just pass, say anything and then it will pass. No. It doesn't work like that. Okay, so here is where you practice this kind of work. Okay, I'll be sending the papers after iftar. Okay, so that you can think about what I've said. But as I said, the grades are from excellent and to fail, unfortunately. So at this time, you need to work on also, you'll be working on the paper which you're supposed to submit next Sunday. And I hope next Sunday we can also have a session in addition to Tuesday's session. Okay? Any questions? Any questions? Wait, there are 8 messages. Let me see. Yes, this is having to do. Okay. Okay, so I will see you then, inshallah, on Tuesday at 1 o'clock. I will upload, organize a session so that you can come in on Zoom as well. And yeah, and so if you have any questions about the papers, you can email me or Skype or whatever if something is. If you have any questions about the assessment. and evaluations and the comments.